Hello everyone. Wishing you all good health, peace, and the kind of love that gently surprises you when you least expect it. After days away on a demanding business trip, CEO Hung finally returned tired, but with a tender smile in his eyes. What Tieu didn't know was that his heart never left her side. As she stood by the doorway, not expecting much, he gently reached into his bag and pulled out a small bouquet of wildflowers from Cambodia, humble, beautiful, just like her. Then, with quiet care, he slipped a delicate bracelet into her hand. "For the woman I thought of every day," he whispered. In that simple, unexpected moment, Tieu felt her heart bloom. The morning mist still lingered over the quiet hills when the soft rustling of dry leaves whispered of an approaching presence. Tieu, standing by the small wooden shelter, was completely unaware that someone was watching her from afar, someone whose heart had missed her every single day. She bent down, carefully picking up a fallen mango leaf, wiping dust off a small bench, humming softly as birds chirped around her. It was just another peaceful morning, or so she thought. Suddenly, the crunch of footsteps on gravel made her freeze. "Ka," a voice called, deep and familiar, like a melody she'd longed to hear again. She turned around, startled. It was him. Hung. Standing there with his travel-worn backpack, shirt slightly wrinkled, eyes filled with something she couldn't quite name. Maybe relief, maybe longing. "You're back," she whispered, voice barely above the wind. Hung smiled gently and walked closer, revealing what he had hidden behind his back, a bouquet of wild orchids wrapped in banana leaves and a small bracelet made of tiny wooden beads and silver charms. "For you," he said simply. "From Cambodia." Tieu stared at the flowers, then at the bracelet, eyes slowly brimming with tears. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached out, accepting the gifts. "I saw the flowers in a small village market. They reminded me of you, quiet, but deeply rooted. And the bracelet. A lady at a temple said it brings protection and peace." She couldn't say anything, only nodded. Her voice was caught in her throat. "I didn't tell you I was coming back today," Hung continued, "because I wanted to see your true reaction. I missed this, your presence, your calm, even the way you peel fruit and hum without knowing it." Tieu laughed, wiping her tears. "I thought you forgot me," she teased softly. "Never," Hung replied, his voice low and steady. "Even when I'm surrounded by meetings, contracts, and forests of timber, my mind always wanders back to you and little Han." The sun slowly rose higher, casting warm golden light on the earth. The scent of the wild orchids filled the air, mingling with the soft smell of dew and wood smoke. They sat together under the old mango tree, sharing silence, not the empty kind, but the peaceful kind that exists only between two people who truly understand each other. Hung reached for her hand. The bracelet fit perfectly on her wrist, as if it had been made just for her. As the morning light grew stronger, warming the wooden planks of the small shelter, Hung and Tieu sat side by side on the old bench beneath the mango tree. The bracelet shimmered softly on her wrist, catching the sunlight like a quiet promise. "Did everything go well with the wood shipment?" she asked, her voice gentle, her eyes still on the bouquet in her lap. Hung nodded slowly. "It did. There were a few challenges with the customs process, but we managed to secure a solid deal. The timber from Cambodia will help the factory recover. But more importantly, ... He turned to look at her. "I couldn't stop thinking about you. About this place. About Han." At the mention of their daughter, Tieu's face softened. She's still at my mother's house, she said. I thought it would be too hot for her to be up here with me while I cleaned the shelter. Hung stood up and walked a few steps away, gazing out over the green fields stretching endlessly below. You know, he said after a moment, when I was over there, in the middle of meetings and endless negotiations, all I wanted was this peace. You, our child, a home. Tuok stood as well, brushing her hands off on her dress. You have a home, she said quietly. Here, with us. Hung turned toward her, a soft smile forming on his lips. That's all I needed to hear. They spent the rest of the morning together, Tieu sweeping the shelter, Hung helping her fix a broken step, both of them laughing as they teased each other over little things. It felt natural, easy, like no time had passed. As the sun climbed higher, Hung unpacked the small basket of food he had brought with him from the city. Grilled chicken wrapped in banana leaves, sticky rice, a jar of pickled vegetables. They laid everything out on a straw mat and shared the meal like an old couple who had done this 1,000 times before. Do you remember, Hung said between bites, when we first came here after Han was born? You couldn't even hold a broom without me chasing after you to sit down. Tuka laughed. And you tried to cook rice over a fire and burned the pot. He grinned. Still, the worst rice I ever made. But it was the best meal of my life. They both went quiet for a moment, listening to the sound of the wind brushing through the trees, the distant cluck of chickens, and the occasional bark of a dog in the valley below. That afternoon, as golden sunlight spilled across the valley, Hung and Tieu packed a few things into a small basket and locked the shelter door behind them. The path down the hill was quiet, shaded by tall trees and wildflowers in bloom. Hung carried the basket while Tieu walked slowly beside him, her fingers occasionally brushing against the bracelet he had given her. Are you nervous to see Han? Hung asked softly. Tuka smiled, eyes glistening. A little. It's been almost a week. She's probably grown already. You know how fast babies change. Hung chuckled. She recognizes you the moment she hears your voice. They reached the village just as the sun began to dip behind the hills. The warm scent of cooking filled the air. Somewhere in the distance, children were playing, their laughter echoing between the trees. At her mother's house, Tieu paused at the gate, her heart beating fast. Hung gently touched her shoulder. You go in first, she whispered. She needs her mother. Hung nodded and stepped back. Tuka pushed the wooden gate open and entered the courtyard. Inside, her mother was gently rocking Han in a cradle, humming an old lullaby. The moment she saw her daughter, the older woman smiled and stood up. She's been waiting for you, she said softly. Tuka stepped forward, tears springing to her eyes as she leaned over the cradle. Baby Han blinked up at her, then broke into a small, gurgling smile. My dear child, she whispered, lifting the baby into her arms. Han nuzzled into her chest, her tiny hands clutching at her mother's dress. Hung stood in the doorway, watching silently, his eyes full of emotion. He had seen many beautiful things in his life, grand buildings, pristine forests, sparkling cities, but nothing compared to this moment. The woman he loved holding their child, surrounded by the warmth of family. Later that evening, after dinner, as the stars began to appear in the night sky, Hung and Tieu sat outside on a wooden bench, with Han asleep in her arms. I've made a decision, Hung said suddenly. Tieu turned to him, curious. What kind of decision? I'm going to build our house, a real one, not just the shelter on the hill. I want Han to grow up in a place full of laughter and love, not in between my business trips, not between fear and uncertainty. Her eyes widened. But what about your company? I'll still run it, he said, but I'll run it differently. James can handle most of the day-to-day operations. I've been chasing success for years. Now I want to build something that really matters. Tuaka looked down at Han, then back at Hung. Her voice was barely a whisper. And, what about us? Hung leaned closer, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. There is no me without you anymore. I want us to be a family, truly, completely. Tuka couldn't hold back her tears. But this time, they were tears of hope. Life lesson: the most precious things cannot be bought. In life, we often chase success, promotions, profits, recognition. We move fast, thinking happiness lies in the next achievement. But sometimes, it takes stepping away from the chaos to realize that the most precious things are the quiet moments, the laughter of a child, the warmth of a home-cooked meal, the soft touch of a loved one's hand. Hung, a successful CEO, spent years building a business empire. But it wasn't until he stood in front of a small wooden shelter, watching the woman he loved hold their daughter, that he truly understood what rich meant. Not in money, but in love, in peace, in belonging. To us, a humble woman never asked for much. Her joy came from selling fruit under the sun, rocking her baby to sleep, and waiting patiently for the man she loved to return home. In her simplicity, she held the strength to build a family with resilience, hope, and quiet grace. Together, they discovered a powerful truth. Success means little if you have no one to share it with. A home is not made of walls and roofs. It is built from care, from forgiveness, and from choosing each other, day after day. So, no matter how far we go in life, may we never forget to return to the people who wait for us. May we always value the ones who love us, not for what we have, but for who we are. Because at the end of the journey, it is not the trophies on the shelf, but the hands we hold, and the hearts we return to, that truly matter.